Welcome everyone to MTG Rebellion's State of the Meta. I'm Darth Rictus of the Darkstream, and today we're going to walk through what Standard looks like on Week 4 after the bans.
I'm Max Damage. Comment below if you have any questions as we navigate through the changes. Let's untap.
For those that are new to these meta breakdowns, Tier 1 is reserved for the decks we see achieving trophies or at least consistent top 8s across the weekend's tournaments.
Tier 2 holds a great deal of promise. These are archetypes that, with some fine-tuning, will have a very likely chance to move up to Tier 1 status eventually.
And finally, Tier 3 decks, they're not positioned well in the current meta, but we keep an eye on them in case someone tunes up a new version that can break through, which you will actually see happen this week.
Oh yeah, this week you'll notice we added Esper Control to the tier list, so let's go ahead and move on to the rankings and discuss the latest round of shifts.
Alrighty, so we have a huge shakeup in the tier list this week, starting with the rise of Orzhov Control. For those who recognize it from last week, it was at Tier 3 last week, and it is up in Tier 1. Esper Control and Mono Black Aggro join it, and let's note that all 4 of these Tier 1 archetypes are at least splashing black, if not outright playing it monocolored.
Meanwhile, we see that Mono Red has fallen to Tier 2 status, and Demir Midrange seemingly falling off a cliff down into Tier 3 land.
Lastly, you're going to notice that Azorius Soldiers and Domain have been maintaining ground, while Rakdos Midrange, Azorius Control, and Selesnya Enchantress fell to Tier 3.
We've got a ton of ground to cover today, so let's get started with Esper Legends. Rictus, please walk us through their archetype breakdowns.
Oh yeah. It isn't splashy, nor has there been a ton of innovation for this archetype, but it keeps putting up top 8s, and that's what matters to us. The latest build, it feels pretty close to optimal. We got the 20 legends that everybody's going to keep seeing: Rafine, Shieldred, Dennick, Rona. You're going to keep seeing these over and over again, and the Skrelvs. The 2 flex slots are going to AO in this build, and the other 12 slots are going to Removal, Wedding Announcement, and Make Disappear. This shift from Thalia and Adeline over to Wedding Announcement and Make Disappear has paid a lot of dividends for this deck in having lines of play it desperately needed. And while the sideboard to this list probably needs some tuning, we are getting closer every week. I really like that we've finally condensed this deck into the parts that can move and the parts that can't. You know, the 20 legends that just make up the core of this deck between Skrelv, Dennick, Rafine, Shieldred, and Rona. That's a great core.
Oh yeah.
That's a strong core. And the flex slots, I think, are appropriate for where we're at in the meta, where you have to have a lot of respect for the aggro archetypes, but these Make Disappears, and you see the Disdainful Strokes on the sideboard with some Urtais, it's got game against the control archetypes that are starting to pop up, and I really like where it's positioned. The only card I straight up disagree with is AO at the top end, but I could be wrong. I haven't played a lot of Esper Legends lately.
That makes sense. I have been trying this deck out for the past week, and with the adjustments that you and I have talked about, I've tried it with Raven Man, I've tried it with Rad Rabbik. The flex slots I'm still unsure on. And I would also add the 1-drop slot. I saw that you had 2 cut downs in there. Sometimes you'll see 2 duresses, depending on, you know, whether, and we are starting to see a rise in the control decks out there in the meta. So I wouldn't be surprised to see that change as well, or shift.
Absolutely. I noticed that the sideboard of this had Razor Lash Transmogrant as a 4 of. I don't know that I agree with that as a 4 of in this meta anymore. Like back in the days of Big Bad Rakdos with Fables and Invokes, absolutely. I actually played 4 in the main for a while there. It was such an issue. But, you know, we're into the territory of ossification and lay down arms, and Razor Lash doesn't look great there. We're also running into a scenario where Mono Red has forced people to run more basics, which makes Razor Lash not as easy to get out when we're no longer dealing with those Grixis mana bases that are greedy as hell. And frankly, we have more slots we can chop for duress. You know, like we can get at least 2 duress, like a 2-2 split with Razor Lash and duress, and we're not really losing from our creature count because we're boarding in the Disdainful Strokes. We can board in some duresses and just sideboard out the cut downs and then go for the throats. And we're not fucking with the creature count. We still have enough threats. So I don't know. I'm back and forth on these Razor Lashes as a 4 of.
Yeah, and I think it's important just to highlight, reiterate probably underline, say for the third time, there is a 20 creature core to this deck that really doesn't shift at all. And as long as you maintain that core, you can pretty much be flexible with this deck as you need. I know in the past we used Thalia in that slot, and since we've taken Thalia out of the deck, I think that's really opened up possibilities for it to adapt and respond to the other decks that are out there. So we'll keep an eye on this one. This one's a standard veteran and a standard tier 1 veteran at that, has seen tier 1 stats for a long time.
Oh yeah, this is, at this point, it's the longest veteran of tier 1. Everything else has moved up and down, but Esper Legends puts up top 8s every single week.
Oh yeah. Let's shift on over to something new to tier 1 status, something that we've been seeing for a few weeks now, but I think lately has taken on an iteration that is closer to more pure control. Not exactly, but something very close. Talk to us about Orzhov Control and what we can expect from that deck right now.
All right, guys, so we started at tier 3. Now we here, tier 0 to tier hero. This is the biggest surprise from the weekend, taking down MTGO Challenge number 2 of the weekend in true fashion. Honestly, I thought this deck would be kept out of the fray all season by Domain, but we've seen it rise in direct correlation with the fall of the format's boogeyman. And I love where this list went, from the acknowledgement that Duress is a key sideboard card that cannot be eschewed, as traditional white mid-range lists have to do, to the reasoning that a few Breach of the Multiverse at the top end is worth the black splash as a whole. Plus, there's still a 7-mana walker sitting on that sideboard all the way down here that, you know, it's just waiting to ruin someone's day. I love what this deck's doing, and it is my pick for favorite tier 1 deck this week. Just a few things to quickly note. Whoever came up with Obscura Storefront over running more Tri-lands, well done. That was brilliant. That in combination with Sarah Paragon, beautiful. Chef's kiss. I love it. I love it. That was absolutely brilliant. To the person who decided 4 Paragons and 4 Wandering Emperors, 8 4-drops was in fact viable, also chef's kiss. You were right. This deck really stomps. So whoever came up with this, and I didn't double check the names on it, I love it. Your list is fantastic. I don't even want to change a card to start. I just want to test this list and see where it goes.
Yeah, truly magnificent deck. It's, as has been said, mono white with a splash of black to just give you the strongest pieces that you can. And early iterations of the deck had that Kaya in the main board. I like the shift over to Breach. I think Breach is a very effective card with what's seeing play out there right now. Being able to steal, for example, Domain's big cards is a huge deal. Yes. Another thing of note, I saw the Phyrexian Vindicators in the sideboard. How do you personally feel about that? I actually very much agree with that card, and I think it's underutilized. But what matchups do you think? I think it's the aggro matchups. Am I correct?
Yeah, I mean, it sits there as a wall against Azorius Soldiers, against Mono Red, and it says, deal with me or die in 4 turns. And if they can't deal with it, it also just lets you immediately stabilize and enter a game state where they need to overload the board and thus overload into a Wrath effect. Or they need to play removal, which means they're diluting the power of their deck against the rest of what you're doing, because very little of what you're doing cares about individual removal spells. So I do think it's ideally placed in this kind of deck. I love the inclusion. I haven't gotten to play with it since it came out, really, so I'm a little excited, I'm not going to lie.
Oh, yeah. I think this deck is probably one of the big reasons why we're seeing, and we'll get to it, I'm sure, why we're seeing Azorius Soldiers down in tier 2. But anyway, not to steal that thunder, let's jump into the next one, because I'm really excited about talking about this one. It's personally not one that I can pilot very well, but because of my personal style, full-on control is just really hard. Like, without some like severe win cons, I have anxiety attacks playing control. Like, I'm gonna make the wrong decision. So I tend to stay away from it. But talk to us about what we can expect from Esper Control.
All right, Esper Control didn't take home any trophies, but it did put 4 copies into the top 8 of an MTGO challenge over this past weekend, which to me solidifies it as a tier 1 archetype this week, at least. Instead of messing around with the laydown arms and a clunkier mana base, this build has opted to just play the best of both worlds, having access to a plethora of removal encounters while relying on good old-fashioned card advantage to eventually seal the game. Things accelerate a little bit post-board when you can safely add a few threats that your opponent has to keep potentially dead removal in 4 or suffer the consequences. And we see that in the form of Shieldred and Chromehost Seed Shark. This deck's existence, to me, it proves that perhaps removal in Standard is a little stronger than is wise. And I hope when you play against this, you don't tilt as hard as I do when you find out in game 1 that it's going to end with a Wandering Emperor token or a Phyrexian Might beating you to death, because there are literally no other realistic win conditions in the main of this. It's been a while since I've seen Pure Control. I have never loved it as an archetype, but I do respect what it represents, which is a speed check on the format saying you've got to figure out how to deal with basically nothing but answers deck if you're going to push through. That said, I really want to smash at least 4 Thruns into a sideboard of Domain and go after this deck.
I totally feel that. I'm going to catchphrase here. Color me intrigued. Because this deck on paper for me doesn't look like it can win. Like it literally looks like you're just really trying to bore your opponent to death, right? That's one of the things that Control gets criticized for. But it's beaten me. Like on paper, it doesn't look like it has enough win cons, but it will find a way. And the Mirrex is typically the way, which it feels bad, man. It just feels terrible.
Oh man, this is an archetype. I mean, tilting is a win con. That's what I've learned about a deck like this. Like tilting's absolutely a win con.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. If you don't run out of time, that is. But yeah, that's the mirror. I can't imagine what the mirrors are like during like a pizza box broadcast. Like how long those matches take.
Till somebody's clock runs out, I would assume. I don't think it goes faster than that. I think it's literally just down to clocks running out. Because, I mean, think about it. Let's get to a scenario where you board out all the useless Wraths post-board because you don't need them, and now you're playing Duresses and Chrome Hosts, Shieldreds, Siphon Insights, Disdainful Stroke, Negate. Like, you are literally just going back and forth trying to play this game of who can stick a Shieldred or a Seed Shark long enough to get ahead. That's it. That's the whole match post-board. So the post-board match would be interesting. Pre-board, whoever draws fewer Wraths is probably the answer. Because the Wraths are super dead. So it's, I don't know. Did you get Wandering Emperor down safely? You probably have a good shot.
Yeah, that's really what it comes down to. Who lands the Wandering Emperor? Well, very interesting deck. I really have nothing more to say because I'm not great at piloting those. I like I prefer the Orzhov Control. I preferred Dimir Midrange, but we're going to talk about why that list later on at the end, why that list isn't up here. But let's shift over to the final deck in our tier 1 status. Mono Black Aggro. We've been keeping an eye on this one. We promised that we would keep an eye on this one. Somebody would figure it out. I think I even said it last week, if not the week before. Somebody would figure out Mono Black. So talk to us about what this list looks like as a tier 1 list.
Mono Black is back, baby. Smashing through to take down an MTGO challenge while pushing a few other copies into top 8s in the days leading up to this past weekend. That's what earns it a tier 1 slot at last. I love this build and what it symbolizes for positioning in the metagame. I particularly love the inclusion of the 2 Pithing Needles in the sideboard to push back against all the control lists, rocking Wandering Emperor. That said, I'm a little unclear why there isn't a 4th Mishra's Foundry, whether the 2 Path of Peril is actually correct without a white splash, and whether you need 4 Evolved Sleeper in the end. All that said, like all that aside, I love this list. This list is a nightmare for aggro. Can you imagine piloting mono red and seeing 4 Phyrexian Fleshgorger, 4 Graveyard Trespasser, and 4 Shieldred with Gix's command, and then all this remove? Oh my god. You can't win. There's no way through this deck outside of them mulliganing to fucking 3. And even then, they might get you.
Yeah.
Like, it's absurd how good this aggro matchup is. And you've got game against control. This deck will get shit stomped in all likelihood by Domain, will get shit stomped in all likelihood by Orzhov Control and White Midrange lists, but if you're not playing against those, this is a really good choice. I've played this to a couple top 8s over the last year, lists that are similar to this. Gix's Command, people have been sleeping on it all year. I've been saying since Invoke got banned, this card is real. This is where your 5-drop slot's going to go. I love it. It's so powerful, and it absolutely ruins a few aggro decks while giving you some more game against control in game 1. It's not completely dead, you know?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Who doesn't love being able to pilot Mono Black and say that it's a successful tier 1 status list? I think that it's really the underdog right now, and a lot of people are rooting for it to really make it to the top. And I'm not just talking about the content creators who love Mono Black, but personally, when Mono Black is healthy, I think the meta is healthy. And it didn't lose any steam by losing Invoke Despair. It's almost like it didn't really need it at all. It had enough threats 1 through 4 slot to really push through. Where I like to say that Azorius Soldiers and Mono Red Aggro like to win by going low, and something like Orzhov and Esper Control like to win by going high. This deck will go right through you, and that is still the case. So I endorse it. I hope it remains in tier 1 status for quite a while. It's an aggressive list that plays like a mid-range list in terms of how powerful it can be. I mean, it is definitely a powerful list. So, yeah, I endorse it all the way.
Honestly, for me, any excuse to play Friction Arena and Lily of the Veil again, I don't care. Any excuse. I'll play this just because of those 2 cards, because I miss playing those 2 cards from old standards. I'll just do it again.
Yeah, it's the core of the Resource Wars archetype that Mono Black has been good at lately, and in multiple formats, I would say as well.
Oh yeah.
But yeah, Liliana the Veil, yeah, still a very the MTG community was kind of split on her when she came back to Standard at first, and I think now the argument is settled. Like it's Team Liliana all the way.
Yeah, there was a time and place where Lily wasn't well positioned in the meta, specifically with Fable running around and Invoke running around. It just didn't make a lot of sense. I love where it's positioned right now, because there are some decks, like Azorius Soldiers and Wedding Announcement decks in general, where Lily is bad. And it's good that Lily isn't just good everywhere. It's very strong, it's a very strong indicator that the meta is healthy, that Lily is fantastic in some matchups and atrocious in others. And that's where it's at now. It's no longer just too weak for the format, which it was pre-ban. Now it's just reliant on the matchups, and I love that for Lily, because the first time it got printed, it was impossible to stop until they figured out, oh, Lingering Souls, Obstinate Bailout, these were all checks that eventually came into being or were figured out. But I remember the first round of Lily of the Veil. I remember it in Jund in Modern. That is how good it was.
Ooh, yeah. If it sees Modern play, that's a pretty high standard.
Oh yeah.
All right, let's slip on down to tier 2 and talk about some of these decks that either were tier 1 status or have flopped around in some cases. Let's first talk about 5 Color Domain and what's going on with this deck. Has it changed any, or have just the other decks really shifted around it?
So coming in second place this past weekend in an MTGO challenge has allowed Domain to retain its tier 2 status on the ladder, but I'll be honest, I don't love where it's positioned right now. I also don't love the build being shown here, but it's where people seem to be at. I will point out a few things. First, Make Disappear only has 7 potential blue sources for turn 2, and 5 of them come into play tapped, which means they have to come into play turn 1, which makes this really more of a turn 4 or 5 play, depending on Herd Migrations, Topiary Stompers, and Invasion of Zendikars fetching out your sources. That doesn't seem ideal to me, that your Make Disappear isn't reliable on turn 2. Howlpack Piper and T-Rex also seem very underwhelming to me in comparison to Thrun. Some people prefer it that way, but I don't know. I just don't love it. Thrun has to get answered with a Wrath. Tyrannix Rex can be answered with a Fateful Absence and 4 mana, or just a Void Rend at 3. I mean, it's just underwhelming to me. Lastly, the push for Vanquish the Horde over the final 2 copies of Sunfall also seems wrong to me, because Vanquish requires at least 4 creatures by turn 4 in order to come down a turn earlier than Sunfall. I can't imagine that's the norm. Even Mono Red rarely presents 4 creatures on turn 4. Typically, they present 3. So mathematically, I can't see where Vanquish the Horde is actually stronger, especially because it's Destroy, not Exile. And Sunfall's giving you a threat on top of that. So, I don't know. I don't agree with the way that list was constructed, but it did get second place in a challenge. Maybe I'm missing something, And I'm, comment below. Let me know what I'm missing. I'd like to know. I love Domain as an archetype. I've been messing around with a few builds. If this is the ideal version, I want to know where I'm wrong on my logic.
I've also seen Depopulate take that slot over Vanquish the Horde as well. What do you think about I think for the same reason, Depopulate allows them to draw a card. It's 1 turn sooner than Sunfall, so I can kind of see the argument for Depopulate. What do you think?
I prefer Depopulate to Vanquish in the list that I ran. I ended up off of both of them and just doing 4 Sunfall and a couple Wandering Emperors. But if you're going to go for 6 Wrath effects, the next two after Force Sunfall would be to depopulate just because it's a turn faster. And I'll be honest with you, them drawing an extra card, it's not as relevant in a lot of matchups because, again, your domain, you're drawing so many extra cards. Attracts is like a 6-for-1 sometimes. So if they get one extra card, that's less relevant to me than making sure the board gets swept right fucking now.
Yeah, that makes absolute sense. What other things would you suggest over the Make Disappear? I know in the past we've go all in on Sunfall before. Is that the choice, do you think?
Yeah, I'd rather go in on Sunfall. I would rather shave an Atali for one Courier's Briefcase so that we can push towards the Invasion of Zendikars on turn 3 or the Archangel of Wraths on turn 3. Because sometimes an Archangel of Wrath, even without kicker, is enough. Like against Azorius Soldiers, for instance. Sometimes you just got to dump an Archangel into play and they just sit there and stare at it. You know, like how are they going to push through a 3-4 with lifelink? It buys you 1 or 2 more turns to get to that Sunfall, to get to those Atraxas. So I like a copy, exactly one, of Courier's Briefcase over one of the slots that goes to Make Disappear. And then I like to push the other one into Sunfall. Atali versus Breach, we've talked about it in the sideboard guide. Check that out if you'd like to see where we took this deck a few weeks ago. And I believe in Breach, not Atali, but you know, people will differ with me on that one. Overall, I feel like the domain list, this isn't an optimized list, but it is trying out some interesting concepts. So, I don't know. Again, I might be wrong. Comment below. Let me know what you think. Tell me why I'm wrong if I'm wrong.
Yeah. One final note that I want to make before we move on to talking about the next list is that the ramp is strong. I think Domain has revealed that ramp is a thing now. Topiary into Invasion of Zendikar is something being used in Simic and Mono Green, sort of off this meta tier list right now. People are trying to unlock those decks as well. But yeah, I think there's a possibility there. We're also seeing it in some like alternative versions of Domain where they're running more Bant style cards. And I'm also seeing like a Jund style Domain out there. Whatever iteration you're seeing, that is the core of the deck. And I think it just speaks to the fact that there's some really strong 7-drops right now in Standard. And ramp is a strong thing in Standard at the moment. But comment below if you're feeling me on that one, if you have one of those alternate lists that you want to share or talk about or discuss. All right, let's move on to one of those lists that chops low, Mono Red Aggro. Talk to us about the current iteration, some of the adjustments that have been made.
So in both MTGO challenges over the weekend, we saw Mono Red in the top 8, one in the top 4, and I mean, it keeps putting up some results, so it sticks to tier 2. That said, people are figuring out how to contain this list, so I am moving it back down to tier 2 for that. The rise of Mono Black also spells disaster for this archetype. I mean, Trespasser, Flesh Scorcher, Shieldred, along with the best removal. Do you really want to try to play through that? I don't, not with Mono Red. I also note that this archetype is amazing when Furnished Punisher is well positioned. It's not well positioned anymore. If you look at all the tier 1 decks outside of Esper Legends, and I guess Esper Control to a degree, but like Orzhov Control, plenty of basics, no issues. Mono Black, obviously like 22 basics. You're not getting them with Furnace Punisher like ever. So if Furnace Punisher isn't well positioned, I don't like this archetype personally, because we get into a scenario where your best 3-drop is no longer relevant as anything more than a hill giant with Menace. That's not great. That's not great.
Yeah. This is really the only Mono Red that's relevant at the moment too. There was, I think at the very beginning of the post ban, there was like a big red that was floating around using Koth, that kind of thing. But that since has fallen by the wayside. There's just better things to do if you're trying to go for a mid-range game. And I don't know. We'll see. We'll keep an eye on this one, see if it stays around tier 2. It may drop to tier 3. That's my prediction for next week. What do you think?
It's hard to say because, again, people that aren't prepared for this get run over by this. And if Esper Legends and Esper Control really continue to dominate in the tier 1 status, I can see where Furnished Punisher matters. But if we're seeing Orzhov Control, White Midrange, Mono Black, even Domain, I don't, like, as a Domain player, I actually don't worry about the Mono Red matchup that much these days. I feel pretty good about it with all the weird life gain that's been added into, like, herd migration, etc. Like, you have a lot of game against this archetype, weirdly. But if we're going to keep seeing that, then yeah, I don't think mono red is going to be viable. So it just depends on the meta. It's very much a meta call on how it's going to do week to week. It has the potential to be a tier 1 archetype. It reminds me of Dredge in Vintage, where if people have graveyard hate, you're so fucked. And if they don't have graveyard hate, you're going to run them over. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Let's shift on over to the other deck that chops low, but I would argue, and we'll discuss this, Azorius Soldiers, I think, is just a bit more resilient than Mono Red. So talk to us about Azorius Soldiers, what the current state of it looks like right now.
God, I love this deck. We're seeing this build solidify as expected. There are 6 1-drops. That has become the staple for recruitment to Skrelv. We're seeing about 1 billion 2-drops. That's also a staple now of this archetype. The 4 Sky Strike at the top end. And usually there's a weird, funky 4-drop, which in this case is a Wandering Emperor. And the fact that it's a 4-drop with Flash really emphasizes that this deck is now the premier tempo deck in the format. It doesn't have the same weaknesses that Mono Blue has as a tempo deck. Lithomantic Barrage is not terrifying to this list. Duress is not terrifying to this list. And that's part of where it draws its strength from. That there isn't an easy solution to this deck. If it gets ahead of you, you're usually pretty fucked. And let's note there are 3 Takazia's Welcome sitting in this sideboard to help you grind. This works extremely well with these Zephyr Sentinels that just keep bouncing all the cards that trigger Takazia's Welcome while also triggering it on your opponent's turn, allowing you to draw up to 2 extra cards a turn. So I feel like this deck might as well just be called Fuck Around and Find Out, because if you focus on just killing the threats without applying any of your own pressure, you will find out just how hard those hands can be thrown.
Oh yeah, this deck is very resilient and takes on a few different forms, but I think I like where we've settled on the list, as we just saw with the Zephyr Sentinels, with the Takazia's Welcome in the sideboard. Nobody really thinks about this aggro list as a tempo list, but it really should be thought of more as that. I personally play it with Kayla's Reconstruction, which just makes it even more a tempo list. You're trying to basically use Protected Negotiators, Spell Pierce to kind of just delay your opponent's board wipes, delay your opponent's disruption even, and then if they do happen to board wipe, you have Kayla's Reconstruction to just basically build your board state back up. But there are certainly other tools that can be used as well to do similar things, like, Knight of Errant Eos. I like where this deck is positioned right now as sort of a more aggro list. I think this one matches toe-to-toe with Mono Black. So that's kind of one of my standards for, whether I should play this list versus something like Mono Red is who wins that matchup, because I'm seeing a lot of Mono Black personally. So I like using Soldiers. I like grinding with Soldiers in Mythic. What do you think?
I think this is a big reason why that Mono Black list was playing 2 Path of Peril, because there are so many 2-drops in this deck, and Path of Peril is good against both Azorius Soldiers and Mono Red, whereas Glistening Deluge, not so much.
Right.
That said, God, I never know with Azorius Soldiers, because any game where you're winning coin flips, you're on the play, you can get there really fast, and people underestimate it. But when you're on the draw and you get behind with this deck, it feels impossible to catch up. So,
right.
That's why it's tier 2. I haven't seen it take home trophies, but it certainly places in the top 8, and it's a dangerous archetype that in the right hands can go quite a way.
Not a whole lot of great ways to deal with big threats, and I think that's where it lacks. Not a whole lot of great ways to deal with Sheldred unless you're sideboarding in tons of copies of Destroy Evil or Valorous Stance, that kind of thing. But
Absolutely.
You don't really want to do that. I think the margins are tight enough here that it's tough to justify sideboarding in that many copies. But anyways, we'll keep an eye on it. We'll see how it pans out. And feel free to go ahead and comment below. And while you're there, like and subscribe. Let us know that you love this kind of format for our videos. And basically, if you have any questions, if you have any comments, you disagree with where we position things, let us know. We'd love to discuss those things with you down there in the comments. All right. So, Darth Rictus, you have any final comments about this for the folks at home?
I love that this. I mean, we're 13. Was it 13 decks deep now into this format? I believe. Wait, no. We're at 15. Holy shit! 3, 6, 7.
Yeah, that's
14. 14 decks in this
wild.
meta. That's a really healthy standard, guys. And the fact that
Yeah.
tier 1 has shifted every single week also tells me there's a lot of room for development. There's a lot of room for some interesting brewing. It's a very deep format. Take some time, pick an archetype you like, learn it. That is what I would recommend. Don't try to go with the flow every week and figure out which deck's going to be on top this week to that week. Find a deck you like, find a deck you can pilot competently, and start tuning it. Start prepping it, because its week will come in all likelihood based on how much this is shifting.
Oh, yeah. I totally endorse that statement. Find something you like and play it. I think that's the main message here, because all of these are open lists. They're all able to win and able to get you there. So just, fine tune the one you like. All right. So don't forget to like and subscribe. And until next time, from all of us at the Rebellion, untap, upkeep,
Resist.